I've never been the loudest man in the room. I've always believed that noise doesn't prove work does. Maybe that's why, through most of my life, people mistook my silence for weakness. They thought because I didn't argue, I didn't understand. Because I didn't compete, I couldn't win. And because I never bragged, I had nothing to show. It's a funny thing. They can know you your whole life and still never really see you. When my sister passed away, her 2 sons were still in college. I was the one who helped them with tuition, helped them get their first cars, helped them find their first apartments. I didn't do it because I wanted gratitude. I did it because that's what family does. You help where you can, you stay quiet about it, and you let people grow. Years went by. They built their lives, and I settled into mine, a modest 2-story home on the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with trimmed hedges and maple trees that turn the color of fire each autumn. After retiring from 38 years in property management, I filled my days with small routines, reading the paper at sunrise, tending the hydrangeas, and fixing things no one else noticed were broken. Sundays were for family brunches. My brother hosted them in his wide suburban house with white columns and an immaculate lawn that looked like it was cut with scissors. Everyone came dressed like they were auditioning for success, expensive watches flashing over mimosa glasses, conversations that circled around promotions, vacations, and who had the newest Tesla. I usually sat at the far end of the table, next to the window, nursing my coffee and watching their words float around like perfume, pleasant, but empty. My nephews Jacob and Ryan had changed since those college days. Jacob wore sharp suits even on Sundays, like the world was a boardroom waiting to be conquered. Ryan, younger by 3 years, carried the restless energy of a man convinced he'd already outsmarted everyone older than him. They'd started a tech company together, some app that connected contractors with homeowners. I didn't understand the details at first, but I understood ambition. They spoke about it like it was the next Apple, like they were on the brink of something world-changing. Every time they brought it up, the rest of the family leaned forward, eyes bright, feeding on their confidence. I remember one brunch clearly. The sunlight fell across the tablecloth in golden lines, and the smell of roasted ham mixed with coffee and cinnamon rolls. Jacob was explaining their expansion plans, something about investors and new offices downtown, when he looked over at me. "You probably wouldn't get it, Uncle," he said with that polite smile people wear when they're actually dismissing you. "It's kind of a modern thing. Data, automation, all that stuff. You're more old school, right?" The table chuckled. I smiled too. I had no reason not to. Ryan joined in. "Yeah, Uncle still writes checks," he said. "He probably thinks cloud means the thing that ruins a picnic." They laughed harder than the joke deserved. My brother, their father, tried to smooth it over. "Hey now, don't tease him. He's the reason you boys made it through school." But that only made it worse. Jacob lifted his glass and said, "To Uncle, the family's charity foundation." The toast was meant as a joke, but it stung all the same. I raised my cup of coffee, pretending not to care, but inside something shifted. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet realization that the line between kindness and foolishness is invisible until someone crosses it. That night, after everyone left, I sat on my porch under the soft glow of the motion light. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. I thought about my sister, how proud she would have been of her sons, how she used to tell me, "You're their steady hand, their compass." Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe compasses are meant to be ignored until people get lost. I still remember the night the betrayal began, though at the time I didn't recognize it as such. Jacob called me one evening, his tone unusually friendly. "Uncle," he said, "we're doing a second round of funding for the company. Just a small seed round. We want to let family in before outsiders. You know, keep it in the bloodline." I asked a few questions: how much, what for, what the risks were. They spoke confidently, almost rehearsed, assuring me it was safe, that even a small stake could grow tenfold. I'd saved quietly over the years, not a fortune, but enough. I told them I'd think about it. The next week, I met them at a small cafe downtown. Ryan arrived late, as usual, talking into his Bluetooth earpiece. Jacob slid a sleek presentation folder across the table. Inside were graphs, logos, and projected numbers that could make any man dizzy with optimism. "This," Jacob said, tapping the page with a pen, "is the future. The construction industry's going digital, and we're leading the charge. You come in now, your family and an early investor. You'll thank yourself later." He was right about one thing. It was the future. But not for the reasons he thought. I signed the papers a week later. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to see what my nephews could do when someone believed in them. They thanked me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Months passed. The company grew faster than anyone expected. News articles began to mention their names, calling them young innovators and visionaries. At family gatherings, everyone spoke about them like they were already millionaires. No one mentioned the quiet uncle who had signed one of the first checks. I didn't mind. Not at first. Pride has its own quiet satisfaction. But success is a mirror. It shows people who they really are. It started small. Missed calls. Unanswered messages. Invitations that never reached me. Then, during one brunch, I overheard Ryan talking to his cousin about how some people just don't get modern business. He said it loud enough for me to hear. Jacob laughed. It's not his fault. He still thinks owning property is the best investment. Poor guy doesn't even realize he's obsolete. Obsolete. That word stayed with me like a splinter. A few weeks later, I called Jacob to ask about the company, how it was doing, how my small investment was faring. He sounded irritated, rushed. "Yeah, it's fine, uncle. But honestly, you shouldn't worry about the details. We're handling the big stuff. Your part's just symbolic." "Symbolic?" I asked. "Yeah, like a gesture. You were supportive early on, but the paperwork's complicated now. Legal restructuring, share conversions, all that. Nothing you need to stress over." Something about his tone told me the truth before the words did. I asked for documentation. He promised to send it. Weeks went by. Nothing came. Then, one evening, I received an automated email from their company announcing new board members and investors. My name wasn't listed anywhere. When I called, no one answered. When I emailed, I got polite delays. "We're in meetings. We'll follow up soon. We'll have legal handle it." That was when I realized I had become invisible. They hadn't just ignored me. They had erased me. It wasn't just business, it was betrayal wrapped in politeness. I spent nights staring at the signed copy of the initial agreement. The ink faded slightly where my pen had pressed too hard. I remembered every promise they'd made, every word about family and legacy. I kept replaying Jacob's laugh that day at brunch, when he'd called me obsolete. It was no longer funny. One Sunday, I decided to show up uninvited. The brunch was in full swing when I walked in, carrying a bottle of wine I knew they'd never open. Conversations slowed as I entered. "Uncle," Ryan said, surprised. "Didn't know you were coming." "I figured I'd drop by," I said calmly, setting the bottle on the counter. "I wanted to ask how the company's doing." "Haven't heard much lately." Jacob gave a practiced smile. "It's going great. We're in the middle of a private valuation, kind of complicated stuff." I nodded slowly. "And my shares? Still safe, I hope." His smile tightened. "About that, uncle, there were some adjustments. You might have gotten diluted when we restructured." "Diluted? It's standard. Legal stuff. You still technically hold a piece, just not as much." The room grew quiet. My brother looked uncomfortable. I asked, "So how much exactly do I own?" Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "A fraction." Paperwork got messy. But don't worry, it's nothing personal. Nothing personal. I looked around the room, my family, the same people I'd helped through school, through life, and saw strangers in their place. That night, I went home and sat in my study surrounded by old files, receipts, and photographs. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I took out the investment documents again and read them line by line, tracing the signatures, the dates, the legal phrasing. And there it was, buried in the fine print, an oversight they hadn't noticed. A clause about convertible shares that, under specific conditions, gave me more control than they'd ever realized. I leaned back in my chair, the corners of my mouth lifting just slightly. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. The same hands they'd mocked for being old-fashioned were about to turn the gears of their future. And so began the quiet revenge of a man they thought was obsolete. The night after that brunch, I didn't sleep. The house creaked in the quiet, expanding and settling like an old man sighing. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, each drop like a thought I couldn't shake loose. The hydrangeas I'd planted years ago bent under the weight of the storm, their blooms trembling in the wind, loyal things, still standing even when everything around them had shifted. I sat in my armchair in the dim light, holding the first contract I ever signed with Jacob and Ryan. The paper had a faint coffee stain near the corner. Ryan's doing, I remembered. He'd been so nervous that day, his hand shaking as he passed me the cup. Back then, his gratitude had been real. His voice had even cracked when he'd said, "We won't forget this, Uncle." But people forget, especially when remembering costs them something. The clock struck 2 in the morning. I got up and walked through the house. Every room carried echoes. The living room still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. My wife's photograph sat on the mantel, her smile steady, her eyes patient, as though she already knew how everything would unfold. She'd passed away 8 years ago, cancer taking her with the same quiet efficiency she'd once brought to everything she touched. Am I becoming bitter, or just awake? I asked her picture. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was an answer I didn't want to hear. I made coffee at dawn. The ritual steadied me, the grind of beans, the hiss of steam, the first dark pour. I sat by the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake. Lawns glistened with dew. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler sputtered to life. For most of my life, mornings like that had meant peace. But now, they carried a different weight, the weight of a man realizing how easily kindness can be mistaken for irrelevance. The following days blurred together. I went about my routines. Grocery shopping, repairing a loose gate hinge, trimming the hedges. But beneath the small chores, my mind kept replaying every slight, every laugh that had cut deeper than it should have. It's strange how the mind hoards humiliation more faithfully than love. One afternoon, I decided to clean my study. There were old boxes stacked in the corner, tax papers, photos, and yellowing receipts. As I sorted through them, I found a folder labeled Family Vacations. I opened it and out slid a picture from 15 years ago. Me, Jacob, and Ryan fishing at Lake Murray. Jacob had caught the biggest trout that morning, and Ryan had been jealous. He'd sulked until I handed him my rod and let him reel in the next one, pretending it was his. When he smiled, his face had lit up with something pure, something I hadn't seen in years. I remembered thinking back then, they're good boys. They'll do great things. And now, those good boys had turned into men who looked at me and saw a relic. As I stared at that photograph, I realized something that tightened my chest. It wasn't just betrayal that hurt. It was the loss of meaning. For years, I believed my presence in their lives mattered, that my quiet support had shaped them. But in their world of investors and digital empires, I had become background noise. That realization broke something, not my heart, but the illusion that I still belonged. A few days later, I ran into my neighbor, Mark, while checking the mail. He was a retired accountant, the kind of man who always had advice about markets and real estate. We chatted briefly, and I must have let something slip because he looked at me curiously. "You okay, old friend? You look like someone's been using your soul as a punching bag." I gave a dry smile. "Just thinking about family," he said knowingly. "The only kind of pain that doesn't show up on X-rays." He invited me inside for a drink, and as we talked, I told him not everything, but enough. Enough for him to lean back, whistle low, and say, "You know, if you still have your original paperwork, you might have more leverage than you think." Leverage. The word lingered in my mind all evening. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about balance. That night, I took out my old lockbox. Inside were documents I'd saved from every property, every business venture, every contract I'd ever signed. Decades of precision and patience in paper form. I had always been meticulous, something my late wife used to tease me about. "You keep every receipt like it's sacred," she'd say. Maybe she was right. But for once, that habit felt like a gift. I spent hours cross-referencing signatures, dates, and clauses. I highlighted phrases that might mean something, legal terms that Jacob and Ryan probably hadn't even read. They were smart, but they were young, too eager to move fast, too confident to imagine an old man could keep up. Every line of ink reminded me of a truth I'd forgotten. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in fine print. Still, the emotional weight didn't fade. In quiet moments, I'd hear their laughter, that mocking tone, the word obsolete echoing through my mind. It wasn't the insult itself that stung, but the ease with which they'd said it. I began to replay memories in vivid detail. The sound of Jacob's expensive watch clinking against his glass as he toasted to the family's charity foundation. The way Ryan leaned back in his chair, eyes full of the arrogance only youth can afford. The faint smell of truffle oil and champagne at that brunch, the sunlight glinting off the silverware, it all came back in fragments, each one a reminder of the quiet humiliation I'd swallowed for years. One evening, I walked through their company's public website. My name was nowhere, not even a footnote. Yet I remembered sitting beside Jacob at his mother's funeral, promising her I'd look after her boys. That memory hurt more than any financial betrayal. I didn't cry. I haven't cried in years. But something inside me went still, like the surface of a lake before a storm. The next morning, I visited the small park where I used to take them when they were kids. The benches had been repainted, the playground replaced with sleeker, safer equipment. I sat under the same oak tree where I'd once tied Ryan's shoelaces and listened to the distant hum of traffic. There's a point in every man's life when he realizes no one's coming to apologize. That no one's going to see your worth unless you show it, not through words, but through results. That realization settled into me like stone. In the evenings, I started walking more. The rhythm of my steps helped untangle thoughts. I passed by construction sites where young men barked into phones, barking the same jargon Jacob and Ryan once used. I realized the world was full of people mistaking speed for progress. But I also knew something they didn't. Empires built without humility collapse quietly, not in explosions, but in silence, when no one's watching. I began to see their downfall in flashes, not because I wished harm, but because I understood balance. Every arrogance creates its own gravity. Sooner or later, it pulls itself apart. And yet, a small voice whispered in me, "Don't wait for gravity. Be the hand that tips the scale." I returned home that night and opened my study again. The lamp's warm light spilled over the papers like morning sun on a battlefield map. I laid out every document, organized them into folders, and started writing notes in the margins. My handwriting was slower now, but steadier than ever. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm went off, breaking the silence. I didn't flinch. For the first time in months, my hands stopped trembling. I was no longer thinking as the old uncle. I was thinking like the man who once built things from nothing, the man they had forgotten existed. And in that quiet house, surrounded by proof they thought I'd lost, I made a promise. They would learn the difference between a man who's outdated and a man who's overlooked. But before I could plan anything, I needed to confront the truth of my own heart to understand whether revenge was really what I sought. I found the answer in memory. A few days later, I visited my wife's grave. The cemetery was peaceful, the kind of peace that humbles you. I brushed leaves off the stone and whispered, "You'd tell me to forgive them." I smiled faintly. But I'm not sure. Forgiveness teaches as much as consequence. I stayed there until dusk, watching the sky turn the color of rusted gold. As the sun sank, I felt something uncoil inside me, not rage, but clarity. They had taken advantage of my silence. Now, I would use that silence to dismantle everything they'd built on it. When I got home, I poured myself a drink bourbon, the good kind I only opened for company. I toasted the empty room. To family, I said quietly. The one investment that always teaches the hardest lessons. The glass clinked against the table. The house was still, but something in the air had changed. I wasn't broken anymore. I was preparing. And though they didn't know it yet, my nephews had just turned their greatest mistake into my greatest opportunity. It began with a knock on my door. A small, polite sound on a Tuesday morning, the kind of sound that doesn't mean much until you realize what it represents. When I opened the door, a courier stood there holding a thin envelope marked "Shareholder Notice." "Signature, please," he said. I signed without saying a word. Inside, I already knew what it was. The moment the envelope touched my hand, I felt the weight of all those silent months, the ignored calls, the unanswered emails, the condescending smiles. I closed the door, carried the envelope to the kitchen table, and sliced it open with a butter knife. The letter was from the company's legal department. Polished words, empty heart. This notice serves to inform you that your shareholder class has been converted pursuant to the latest capital restructure, resulting in a dilution of holdings below 1%. This change is final. Below that were signatures, Jacobs and Ryan's among them. My nephews had done it. They had erased me in ink. For a long time, I just stared at the paper. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. The world went on as if nothing had happened, but inside me, something had just been born. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud, messy, destructive. This was something colder, sharper. Something that hummed just beneath the ribs like a blade resting against bone. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer beside the original agreement, the one they'd forgotten existed. I remember thinking, so, this is the moment. Every man has a point where tolerance becomes self-betrayal. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the last light fade behind the rooftops. The air smelled of rain and wet asphalt. Cars passed, headlights slicing through mist. And I thought about my life, the decades I'd spent doing things the right way, quietly, without fanfare. I'd never cheated anyone, never asked for more than I earned. But the world doesn't always reward integrity. Sometimes it punishes it. For years, I believed that dignity was its own reward, that doing the right thing was enough. But now I saw that silence can look like surrender to those who mistake decency for weakness. I'd given them everything, my time, my trust, my belief. And they'd built their little empire on that foundation, certain the old man would never notice the cracks forming beneath. But I noticed. And once a man like me notices, he doesn't speak. He acts. I decided to visit their office, not to confront them, but to observe. It was downtown, a glass and steel structure with polished floors and sterile smiles. The receptionist looked up as I walked in. Her voice was sweet but mechanical. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "Just dropping something off." She nodded, distracted, and waved me through. I rode the elevator to the 5th floor, where the company's name, ConstructLink, gleamed in silver letters across a frosted wall. Through the glass partition, I saw them. Jacob, in a tailored navy suit, gesturing at a large digital screen, surrounded by investors. Ryan, at the far end of the table, scrolling on his tablet, laughing at something. They looked untouchable, confident, successful. But there was something else too: arrogance. The kind that blinds men just before they trip. I didn't go in. I just stood there, watching. They didn't see me. Maybe they wouldn't have recognized me even if they had. On the way out, I passed their assistant's desk. She was stapling reports. On top of the stack was a heading that caught my eye: pending IPO filing. An IPO. They were about to take the company public. That meant money. Serious money. And it also meant every document, every share, every signature would soon come under legal scrutiny. I smiled to myself. Outside, the city was loud and alive: horns, chatter, the low hum of ambition. I walked slowly back to my car, my reflection flickering in the shop windows like a ghost that no one noticed. By the time I got home, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to beg for what was mine. I was going to prove it was mine. And when I did, they wouldn't lose just money. They'd lose the illusion of control they'd built their lives upon. I spent the next few days in my study, gathering everything: bank receipts, early contracts, emails, even the hand-signed thank you card they'd sent me after I invested. I built a timeline, mapped every transaction, and cross-referenced it against the original agreement. They thought I didn't understand technology. Maybe that was true once. But I understood systems: how things connect, how every shortcut leaves a trace. And that's when I found it. A small discrepancy in the shareholder ledger. One of their accountants had made a simple mistake: logged my initial contribution under a different conversion class. To them, it was an accounting oversight. To me, it was a legal goldmine. If the company went public under that structure, my diluted shares would automatically revert to their original class, giving me not 1%, but 20% ownership. The same 20% they thought they had stolen. I leaned back in my chair, the soft leather creaking beneath me, and let out a long, slow breath. There it was, the line between being powerless and being patient. For the first time, I felt calm. Not the calm of resignation, but the calm of precision. I realized that revenge isn't about rage. It's about restoration. It's about giving balance back to the scales life tried to tip against you. That night, I slept soundly. In the morning, I called an old friend, Daniel Myers, a retired corporate lawyer who owed me a favor. He'd been one of my tenants years ago when he lost his job and couldn't make rent. I'd let him stay without charging for months. When he picked up, his voice was surprised. "Haven't heard from you in years. Everything all right?" "Better than all right," I said. "I need your eyes on a document." I faxed him the agreements and waited. 2 days later, he called back, laughing in disbelief. "You realize what you have here?" "I think so. You're sitting on controlling interest if this IPO goes through under the current filing. They'd owe you millions. Maybe tens of millions, depending on valuation." His words fell like quiet thunder. "Do nothing yet," he said. "Let them file. Let them declare. Once the SEC has it in record, your rights become enforceable by law." I thanked him and hung up. And in that instant, everything changed. Every humiliation, every smirk, every obsolete joke, they no longer stung. They became fuel. I began to watch them from a distance. Their faces appeared on local business magazines. My brother bragged about them at family gatherings I no longer attended. Their LinkedIn pages filled with praise from investors and journalists. They thought they were at the top. But what they didn't realize was that the mountain they stood on had a fault line, and I was the man holding the map. Each night, I'd sit by the window, the glow of my desk lamp illuminating stacks of papers. I wasn't plotting their ruin out of hate. I was preparing justice disguised as silence. Revenge, I realized, doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it just needs perfect timing. I began reading business reports, learning about IPO schedules, understanding when filings become public, when lockup periods expire, when shares legally convert. Every page felt like a puzzle piece falling into place. And the more I studied, the more I saw the beauty of it. They'd built their empire without ever checking the foundation. They thought I was just an old man with outdated values. What they didn't know was that I'd spent my life managing property contracts, navigating zoning laws, and surviving bureaucracy. Paperwork was my language long before apps and data became theirs. They had forgotten that wisdom doesn't retire. It waits. The breaking point wasn't loud. It wasn't a slammed door or a shouted word. It was quiet. A moment of perfect clarity as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, realizing that I didn't need them to respect me, I just needed them to face the truth. And when they did, I would not raise my voice. I would let the documents speak. Because ink, unlike words, doesn't forget. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I liked the sound of that, but I preferred a different phrase. Revenge is a strategy best served precise. Cold can be a mood. Precision is a method. After my call with Daniel, the retired lawyer, the next weeks became a quiet operating room. There was no spectacle, no dramatic declarations, only small, measured moves that, like stitches, would hold a wound closed until it healed the way I intended. The first thing I did was organize. I made 3 neat stacks on my dining table. Documents, witnesses, and timelines. The documents pile was heavy contracts, bank slips, the early shareholder agreement with Jacob and Ryan's signatures, and an old, dog-eared envelope with their first thank you note inside. The witnesses list was shorter but vital. Daniel, Mark the neighbor, the receptionist at ConstructLink whose name I'd learned by watching The Office, and one of Jacob's former accountants who'd grumbled to me once at a family barbecue about sloppy bookkeeping. The timeline mapped every communication I had with the boys. The cafe meeting, the calls, the brunch where the toast had sliced into me like a blade. The plan, such as it was, could be described in one sentence. Wait for the IPO filing, then strike where their arrogance had left them open. But a sentence isn't a plan. The plan required steps, contingencies, and the slow art of maneuvering without revealing the hand that moved the pieces. Daniel agreed to represent me pro bono mostly because he owed me and partly because he recognized the simplicity of the law on my side. "It's elegant," he said over the phone one night, voice low and amused. They built a house of fame on a misclassified foundation. Once the SEC filing is public, we have leverage. But we need time. Let them lock their shares and assume the lockup protects them, then we move. "How long?" I asked. 3 to 6 months, depending on their timetable, he replied. But we'll create pressure points now. Quiet pressure. No lawsuits yet. No press. Just facts and reminders. The first move was subtle. I asked Daniel to draft a letter. Not an angry letter. Not one that would make a scene. A formal, meticulously polite notice reminding ConstructLink of the original shareholder agreement and requesting immediate clarification on the share classes and conversion schedule. The kind of letter that reads like bureaucracy but carries the cold weight of legal attention. We sent the first notice via certified mail and followed it with an email to the legal department. The assistant at their office confirmed receipt the same day with a curt, "We'll have legal reach out." No one reached out. That silence was a small victory. It told me they were either unprepared or arrogant enough to assume the matter would wither. Either way, it revealed character. Next I began to cultivate allies who were inconvenient for them to ignore. I called the accountant who had complained years ago. At first, he was evasive, afraid of getting involved with family drama. But when I mentioned the IPO timetable and the potential for regulatory scrutiny if the ledgers were inaccurate, his tone changed. If there's a misclassification when they file, they could face questions from the SEC, he said. Institutions hate messy books. I'll take a look anonymously for you. Small victory too. He agreed to review certain entries and report back. I also started attending events where their investors liked to gather. That was deliberate. I didn't confront anyone. I simply listened. Investors spoke in hushed, polished tones about burn rates, valuation multiples, and growth metrics. They didn't know who I was. They assumed I was another neighbor or a retired executive admiring the young founders. I let them speak freely. The more I listened, the more I learned. How eager they were, how many promises had been made verbally but not secured on paper. Promises are cheap when you're drunk on potential. They become liabilities once money is counted. There were setbacks. A week after the first notice, I received a curt letter from Jacob's lawyer, one of those canned responses heavy with legalese and light on substance. It advised patience and suggested that restructuring had been done in the best interest of the company. The wording was smug in its professionalism. I felt something like disappointment less in the letter than in the realization that they had hired polished words to hide raw avoidance. Daniel read the response and smiled thinly. "Exactly what we expected," he said. "Keep that file. It's proof they received notice and chose rhetoric over remedy." Setback number 2 came when the accountant I'd persuaded called, voice shaken. "I dug into their ledgers like you asked," he said. "Some things are messy, but I can't risk my license sending a formal notice without documented proof. They'll deny it. This will be ugly." "Ugly isn't the same as impossible," I told him quietly. "Find whatever you can. I'll handle the rest." He agreed to keep looking. Meanwhile, I began preparing the background to the quieter human elements of the plan that involve patience and perception. I cleaned up my appearance. Not to impress them, but to present myself as an alternate version of the man they'd dismissed. Composed, capable, unruffled. I stopped wearing the old cardigan that had become a kind of armor and started dressing in simple, crisp shirts that said I kept appointments. If people were to take me seriously, even my silence needed to look intentional. I also used their arrogance against them. I reconnected with family members I suspected still respected me, my brother's neighbor, an old friend of Jacob's from school, a teacher who had once preferred my quiet counsel. I didn't ask for loyalty. I reminded them of facts, of early checks I had written, of nights I'd stayed late to help, of the signed thank you note that still sat in my documents pile. Humans are complicated. Most will default to the comfortable narrative until facts insist otherwise. One warm afternoon, as I sat at a cafe writing notes, Ryan nearly ran into me outside, latte in hand. He stopped, blinked, and then forced a smile. "Uncle," he said, the word quick and awkward. "Everything okay?" There was a flicker of recognition, no shame. "Yes," I replied. "Just taking in the day." He laughed nervously and excused himself. He looked over his shoulder once before melting into a crowd of suited men. He didn't see the little smile that touched my face. It was not a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone 2 moves into a chess game. As the IPO filing loomed, Daniel and I prepared contingencies. We considered direct negotiation, regulatory complaints, quiet media exposure, and, if necessary, litigation. I preferred legal routes. They leave traces, and traces are hard for people who build empires on enthusiasm to ignore. We also set a psychological stage. I wanted the boys to feel secure, to be publicly confident only to have that confidence punctured by facts. So we seeded small things. A polite email here, a formal inquiry there. Nothing aggressive, only reminders that someone was watching paperwork with a patient eye. At times, the weight of waiting felt heavy. There were moments when I sat alone and questioned whether I'd become consumed by something I once thought beneath me. I'd look at my hands, the weathered skin, the small scars from a life of repairs, and wonder whether I'd traded dignity for revenge. Then I'd remember the brunch and the joke about the family charity foundation, and the memory would harden into conviction. The small victories arrived like careful taps. The anonymous accountant called back with a soft voice one evening. "There's definitely something odd," he whispered. "A ledger entry that doesn't reconcile with the bank deposits. If this is how they intend to present the capitalization table to the SEC, it won't pass scrutiny. I can document it anonymously. But you need a firmer hand than mine for the next step." Daniel suggested we wait for the official filing to materialize. "If we file a regulatory complaint before they go public, we risk being dismissed as a disgruntled investor," he explained. "If we act after the IPO filing, we can point to concrete misstatements. That's the difference between a rumor and a legal basis." We also began to fortify my position socially. I let a few family members know, in gentle terms, that I was sorting through old investments and desired clarity. Not accusations, just a straightforward request. People heard the tone and offered help, embarrassed by their earlier indifference. That human awkwardness was another small victory. It reminded me that public postures can change when facts are unavoidable. The boys, for their part, continued to move forward in their lives, unaware that the foundations they had bulldozed were already under inspection. They celebrated a new round of funding at a rooftop bar. I watched photos from the event pass across my social feed. Jacob's smile in every frame was bright and untroubled. Ryan posted a clip of himself at a panel discussion, leaning forward with the same restless certainty he had always worn. There were setbacks too unexpected, teeth-grinding setbacks. The firm they'd hired to handle PR reached out to salvage the narrative when our first polite inquiries surfaced in their inboxes. They began to draft statements emphasizing restructuring as strategic and beneficial to all stakeholders. The messaging was smooth. The words were chosen to comfort investors and confuse critics. I realized there would be a war of narratives when the time came. They could spin, misdirect, and flood news feeds with optimistic talk. But they could not change the truth held in ink and ledger lines. You can drown a voice with noise, but you cannot rewrite what has been recorded. One evening, Daniel and I met at his small office. He had red pens and a weary look that now seemed to suit him. He spread pages across his desk and tapped one. "If they file in the next month, we'll prepare an objection to the SEC," he said. "If they wait and the valuation is high, we'll have leverage to negotiate or to force a correction publicly. Both are wins." I nodded, feeling the plan coalesce into clarity. The legalese on the pages looked like a map, dense but legible. I ran my finger along the margin where Daniel had written, in his careful script, "Timing is power." I slept better after that meeting. Not because the future was certain nothing ever is, but because strategy removes the chaos from revenge. It turns emotion into motion. The waiting still existed, but it was now filled with purpose. As the days shortened into autumn, my house seemed to breathe with me. The maple trees outside turned color and shed their leaves in a quiet surrender. I found a rhythm: research in the morning, calls in the afternoon, letters in the evening, long walks at dusk to think and to let the plan rest and settle. I learned to be patient in a new way, which is to say I learned not to confuse speed with effectiveness. And then, at last, the public filing appeared. It was clinical and routine. A PDF posted on a government site no one reads until something goes wrong. I printed it out, turned the pages, and smiled without ceremony. The capitalization table listed the share classes. There, in plain black and white, was the misclassification we'd suspected. Their legal restructuring had indeed treated my original contribution as common stock of a different class. The wording suggested deliberate framing to minimize dilution concerns, but the numbers didn't add up. I called Daniel. "They filed," I said. "Good," he replied. "Now we wait for the market response. Let them ride their wave. They'll assume the filing protected them. They don't know the ledger hides a key." "Do we move now?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "No," he said. "Not yet. But prepare yourself. Once the lockup is signed, and the shares begin converting, we present the correction. That's when the House of Cards sings. I felt a hush fall over me, not of fear but of expectation. Everything I'd done, the letters, the calls, the careful cultivation of witnesses had been for this moment, the moment when facts rather than anger would unmask arrogance. Outside, the evening sky had the kind of clarity that makes you feel both small and exact. In the distance, traffic hummed. The world went on. But inside my calm house, with documents stacked like tidy defenses, I felt an odd sense of gratitude. Not for the pain they'd caused, no, but for the lesson it had given me. Dignity, like any good architecture, needs maintenance. And so I kept preparing. Small tasks, confirming dates with Daniel, getting a notarized statement from Mark about the early investments, making sure the accountant's notes were time-stamped and defensible. Each small victory increased the pressure, a quiet tightening that would, when released, make the boys understand what they had assumed they could discard. The plan was no longer just legal. It was moral and practical. It would remind them that families are ecosystems, not stage sets for performance. It would teach them that when you assume silence equals consent, you build on sand. At night, I lay awake less from resentment and more from anticipation. I pictured the moment, no shouting, no public spectacle, when the ledger would be corrected, when the truth would be logged, and the control they'd stolen would slip back into my hands. I pictured Jacob looking at a document and seeing numbers he had never expected to see. I pictured Ryan scrolling his phone and finding headlines that asked tougher questions than their PR had prepared them for. I had no wish to destroy them. I wanted balance restored and humility returned. If they lost status in the process, that was not my delight. It was a consequence of their choices. The final step in the plan was simple. Timing. And timing, when wielded with patience, is a quiet kind of justice. We were ready. The morning their IPO launched, the headlines glowed with praise. Two brothers redefine construction tech. Their smiling faces appeared on every business feed. Their words echoed in podcasts about innovation and disruption. I brewed my coffee slowly. Steam rose, catching the light through the window. The same quiet kitchen, the same hydrangeas bending in the yard. Nothing about my world looked different. And yet, everything had shifted. I had waited months for this day, the moment when confidence hardens into carelessness. The shares were locked, the filings public, the structure now legal record. The trap was built. All that remained was the smallest pressure to make it close. At 9:30 a.m., Daniel called. "It's live," he said. "You ready?" "I've been ready since the day they toasted to charity," I replied. He laughed softly. "I'll file the notice this afternoon. It's surgical. No fireworks. Just an audit request and a correction clause." "Let it be quiet," I said. "Let them hear the silence before the echo." He understood. Revenge wasn't theater. It was timing. By noon, the correction filing was submitted to the Securities Commission, neatly worded, documented with receipts, contracts, and timestamps. The accountant's anonymous statement, the notarized letter from my neighbor Mark confirming the early investment, and the old agreement signed by Jacob and Ryan were all attached. The evidence wasn't loud, but it was irrefutable. Within 24 hours, their legal department reached out. Polite panic, wrapped in professionalism. The email's tone was syrupy. "We received your inquiry, and we're reviewing the matter internally. We appreciate your patience." Patience. The word almost made me laugh. 2 days later, I drove into the city. Their glass tower shimmered against a pale sky, all angles and reflections. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and ambition. I told the receptionist I was there for a meeting with the partners. She hesitated, then buzzed upstairs. Minutes later, Ryan appeared, tight smile, nervous eyes. "Uncle," he said, "you should have called." "I prefer visits," I said, calm. "Some things deserve eye contact." He led me to a conference room. Jacob was already there, standing by the window. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with all the words we'd left unsaid. Finally, Jacob turned. "We got your filing. Uncle, that could cause problems for us." "Could," I said. "Or should." Ryan tried for charm. "It's all just a misunderstanding. You know how these restructurings get messy. Legal jargon, signatures, different classes of stock." I cut him off. "You mean the part where you changed my ownership from 20% to less than 1 without notice? That kind of messy." The air shifted. Jacob sighed, folding his arms. "You don't understand how startups work. We had to bring in investors. We had to restructure. It wasn't personal." "Nothing ever is," I said quietly. "Until consequences arrive." Ryan leaned forward. "Look, Uncle, we can fix this. Maybe a settlement, a payout." I smiled faintly. "No payout. I don't want money. I want correction. I want the truth restored in ink." Jacob exhaled through his nose. "That would affect our valuation." "Yes," I said. "Truth usually does." The silence that followed was beautiful. It was the sound of realization, the sound of arrogance dissolving. They exchanged looks. Ryan's jaw tightened. Jacob's confidence cracked at the edges. Then Jacob spoke, voice low. "You'd ruin us." "I'd remind you," I corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel's timing was perfect. While we spoke, his office released the public notice, an official shareholder correction request, visible on the same site their IPO had proudly occupied hours earlier. The market noticed. Investors noticed. The stock froze pending review. Ryan's phone buzzed. He glanced down, color draining from his face. "They halted trading." Jacob turned on me. "You went public?" "No," I said. "You did. I just turned the light on." He stared at me, and in that silence, years of dismissal collapsed into disbelief. "You planned this," he whispered. "Every quiet minute," I said. "Every ignored call, every empty promise you were building your ladder. You just forgot whose land you were climbing on." For the first time in a long time, I saw them not as successful men but as frightened boys, scrambling for excuses. I felt no pity, only balance. I stood to leave. "You can have the company," I said, "but not the illusion. The record will show what's real." That's all I ever wanted. Ryan rose halfway out of his chair. "You're destroying us." I looked at him and said softly, "No. You did that the moment you thought kindness was weakness." I left them there, surrounded by glass and panic. Outside, the sky had turned silver. I drove home without music, windows cracked, wind in my hair. The calm felt different this time, not empty, but earned. Over the next week, everything unfolded with quiet inevitability. The correction forced a re-evaluation. The company's valuation dipped, not catastrophically, but enough to sting. Analysts wrote cautious notes about internal ownership discrepancies. Investors demanded explanations. Jacob and Ryan issued statements filled with corporate vagueness. And through it all, I said nothing. I didn't need to. A month later, a revised filing appeared. My name was there, clear, verified, legal. 20% ownership, Class A shares. The headline never said my name, of course. It didn't need to. The numbers spoke loudly enough. Daniel called that evening. "It's done," he said. "You have voting power. They can't remove you, can't dilute without your consent." "Let them keep running it," I said. "They'll work better knowing someone's watching." He chuckled. "You're a patient man." "Not patient," I said. "Precise." That night, I walked through the house, past the photographs, the quiet furniture, the clock ticking in the hall. I felt no triumph. Only peace, the kind that comes when things finally fit where they belong. A week later, an invitation arrived for the next family brunch. I didn't go. They needed their silence more than I needed closure. Months passed. ConstructLink stabilized under scrutiny. Their interviews grew humbler. They stopped calling themselves disruptors and started using words like stewards and responsibility. I smiled whenever I heard them, small evolutions in vocabulary that revealed larger changes beneath. The money meant nothing to me. I donated most of my quarterly dividends to a community tech fund for students who couldn't afford college. The irony wasn't lost on me. My nephews had built a digital empire for profit. I used my share to teach others not to mistake innovation for integrity. Neighbors congratulated me when the story made its quiet rounds. Some called me brilliant. Some called me ruthless. They were both wrong. I wasn't brilliant. I wasn't ruthless. I was simply awake. Awake to how the world works, to how people mistake kindness for surrender. Awake to how silence, when used wisely, can become the loudest force of all. I began spending mornings at the park again, under the oak tree where I once tied Ryan's shoelaces. Children laughed nearby, chasing kites. The air smelled of grass and sunlight. I thought about how easily cycles repeat, how pride, left unchecked, turns even family into strangers. One afternoon, as I fed the ducks, a familiar voice startled me. "Uncle." I turned. It was Jacob. He looked smaller somehow, still well-dressed, but his eyes had the tired shine of someone who'd seen his reflection too clearly for comfort. He hesitated, then sat beside me. "I came to say," he paused. "You were right." I said nothing. He stared at the water. "We were arrogant. We thought we were helping you by simplifying things. We told ourselves it wasn't personal, but it was. We made it personal." I nodded. "The hardest thing about youth is thinking time owes you clarity. It doesn't. You earn it." He looked at me, eyes searching. "Can you forgive us?" I watched the ducks drift lazily across the pond. "Forgiveness is a door," I said. "Some doors stay locked for a reason." He swallowed and nodded slowly. "Fair enough." We sat there in silence until he stood and walked away. The breeze lifted, rustling the leaves. I watched him go, neither angry nor relieved, just quiet. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to them but to myself. There's no such thing as useless age or outdated wisdom. There's only ignored experience. Let people laugh if they must, time laughs last. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in my desk. Life returned to its rhythm. My mornings filled with books, my afternoons with walks, my evenings with peace. I didn't miss their company. I missed what they could have been if humility had arrived sooner. Sometimes at night, I'd stand by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Each glow a story, each shadow a secret. I thought of how easily we forget that silence isn't emptiness, it's potential. They had learned that lesson the hard way. And I had learned mine, that justice doesn't need applause. It just needs patience. So when people ask about the company, I smile and say, it's doing fine. Because it is. Because I am. The world doesn't always reward the loud or the fast. Sometimes it bends, quietly, toward those who simply endure. And if you're still watching this, wondering what you would have done in my place,